Lay down and relax. I shall read to you. Ah, come closer, little human. The fire will speak softly tonight, and I will speak softer still. You wish to hear about medieval battles, not as they shine in paintings, but as they truly were when the mud was still wet, and the wind still carried names away unanswered. I lived through those centuries when your ancestors turned entire fields into voices for dead kings. I watched war rise like weather and fall like rot. And if you had walked beside those armies, even for a single dawn, you would have known at once that history does not care whether you feel brave. It only asks whether you will endure. Let me take you there gently, where England changed hands with a single arrow, where kingdoms were decided by rain, and where human courage stood trembling against things no song could mend. In the year 1066, on a slope near Hastings, England learned what it meant to belong to someone else. King Harold of England had placed his infantry at the top of Senlac Hill, locking their shields together into a living wall of oak and iron that seemed unbreakable. William of Normandy had crossed the sea to claim the island with steel and ambition, and beneath his banner marched cavalry, archers, and hardened soldiers shaped by continental war. The English stood as a single body. The Normans charged again and again uphill, only to be beaten back by the unyielding wall of men. Arrows darkened the sky. Horses screamed and slipped on blood-slick grass. For hours, neither side yielded. Then William's forces pretended to retreat. Exhausted and hungry for victory, parts of Harold's army broke formation to pursue them downhill. That small unraveling cracked the shield wall open. Norman cavalry turned suddenly and encircled those who had chased them. Then came the arrow that history cannot name. Whether by chance or fate, it struck Harold in the face. The king fell. England's line fractured in panic. By nightfall, William stood as conqueror, and I watched ravens circle above a kingdom that did not yet know it had ended. Earlier that same year, before Stamford Bridge cooled, England had already fought a war that most history books rush past like an exhausted breath. Harold had been forced north to confront Harald Hardrada of Norway, whose invasion marked the final thunderclap of the Viking Age. The Norse army, confident and unarmored from the heat, was caught off guard as Harold's troops arrived suddenly and violently. One lone Viking is said to have held the bridge alone for a time, cutting down English soldiers until a spear was thrust up from below the planks and ended his defiance. That bridge ran red. The Norse were broken. The greatest Viking king to ever breathe lay dead beneath English boots. And yet, even after victory, Harold was forced to march south again, exhausted and wounded, only to lose everything at Hastings weeks later. I watched 2 ages die in 1 year, and neither one had the courtesy to leave quietly. Before you drift too far into dreams, little human, a small favor from an old dragon. If you've enjoyed resting here beneath my wings, consider subscribing to my horde of stories. Each new believer helps me gather more treasures and avoid ravaging cities for loot when I'm low on funds. I'm retired now, and my back makes sounds that haunt even me. Now, back to the story. Further north, more than 2 centuries later, Scotland learned that strength does not always belong to the side with better armour. At Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce stood outnumbered before Edward II of England. English knights swelled the horizon in steel and banners. The Scots looked like farmers by comparison, but they carried weapons called schiltrons, long spears locked together into living hedges of death. Robert chose his ground wisely, funneling cavalry into narrow paths where horses could not maneuver, and faith sank heavy into wet soil. When Edward's army charged, it smashed against a wall of sharpened wood and human stubbornness. Horses broke legs and necks. Knights drowned in armor as mud embraced them. By the 3rd day, England's army fled, and Scotland stood claimed not by lineage, but by suffering endured. I remember the smell of wet iron and human breath rising in cool, fevered clouds. And I remember thinking that kingdoms are often born in filth. Across the Channel in France, another battle would prove that triumph does not always belong to the largest army, but sometimes to those who forbid themselves despair. Agincourt in 1415 began in reign so relentless that the ground itself seemed to swell with grief. The French army outnumbered the English severely, but heavy armor turned into prison chains when rain and mud combined. English longbowmen stood behind simple stakes as French knights attempted to charge through thick, suctioning earth. They fell and could not rise. They drowned in mud, with lungs full of prayers and earth. Arrows struck exposed visors and throats. Nobles suffocated beneath their own weight. Thousands of French nobles died that day, not to cleverness, but to weather and hubris. I remember the deep silence afterward, when only crows spoke, and the soil had not yet decided what to do with so many bodies. Not all battles were won with arrows and mud. Some were won with belief alone. During the siege of Orléans in 1429, France was a nation so drained by loss that it began to forget its own shape. English forces had surrounded the city, starving it slowly into surrender. Into this darkness walked a teenage girl named Joan, whom you call Joan of Arc. She arrived not with soldiers, but with certainty. She claimed voices guided her. The men followed her because she said defeat no longer belonged to them. Against reason and against training, France lifted the siege and drove the English back. I watched an army wake up. I watched ash turn into banners, and when Joan was later burned for her sorcery, I watched fire take one of the only humans who ever frightened history itself. Even in death, she won something. France remembered who it was. In England, when winter became witness, the bloodiest battle ever fought upon its soil stained snow into legend. Towton, in 1461, during the War of the Roses, saw men slaughter one another beneath falling snow that would not melt because there was too much blood beneath it. Brother fought brother for the crown. Wind turned arrows into storms. Blades froze to fingers. Rivers ran red for days afterward. No one knows how many died there. The land swallowed them without confession. Only the earth remembers exactly. And then there were the battles you never hear sung in halls, skirmishes lost to decay and hunger, sieges where children thinned into ghosts behind stone walls, villages erased in minutes without history ever caring to write them down, bombards that shook entire cities apart, plague that walked through armies like a monarch no one could defeat. When the fighting ended, survivors did not celebrate. They stared, they drank, they whispered. They did not sleep. If you move east from England and France, you find another wound in the world, called the Crusades, which Europeans insisted on calling holy, even as they buried children beneath them. When the armies first reached Jerusalem in 1099, they did not arrive as knights from storybooks, but as starving men with cracked lips and burning eyes after years of march and plague. When the city finally fell, it did not open like a cathedral's door. It collapsed like a throat cut by desperation. Chroniclers near the scene wrote of blood flowing through streets so thick that boots sank and horses stumbled. The holy city became a furnace of noise and prayer, and screams all tangled together, and faith did not stop blades any more than it does now. Later crusades fared no better. At Hatton in 1187, near the Sea of Galilee, a Christian army baked beneath sun and thirst until it could no longer think, could no longer breathe without pain. Saladin's forces surrounded them patiently, cutting off water and escape alike. When battle finally came, it was not glorious. It was exhaustion trying to swing swords while the world wavered in heat. The Christian army was annihilated not by better weapons, but by geography and thirst, by being lured away from water like animals to a trap. If you stood there, little human, the sun would have killed you before a blade ever tried. And if you survived the fight, disease would have claimed you days later in camps where rats outnumbered hope and bandages were more myth than medicine. And then there were the long wars, the kind that did not erupt and fade, but lingered like rot in the bones of nations. The 100 Years' War between England and France was not a war in the way you imagine one thing ending and another beginning. It was a century of villages burning and borders arguing, while generations lived and died beneath its shadow. Farmers were uprooted again and again. Towns changed flags without ceremony. People learned to pack their lives small enough to flee in minutes. Bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside, looting anything still breathing, often more dangerous than the enemy itself. Entire regions were stripped bare, not by armies, but by the hunger that followed them. I watched fields become memory, and towns become cautionary whispers. No one rebuilt, because no one believed peace would last long enough to bother. If you were alive then, little human, you might never know a year without war. You would grow up hearing it somewhere beyond the hills, and fall asleep, wondering if tomorrow would steal your roof or your family first. History loves kings and battles, but it forgets the thousands who simply woke up afraid every day and called that life. I watched it all as centuries burned one by one. I perched upon towers and ruins still warm with loss. I circled above valleys where no grass dared grow for years. And I learned something humans only learn too late. War never loves you back. It only consumes what you bring and demands more until you are gone. You would not survive medieval battles, little human, not because you are weak, but because you are made for mercy, because you still believe life ends cleanly, because you expect rules in a world written by hunger and steel. Medieval war would not explain itself to you. It would only remove you gently from tomorrow. So rest now. Let the fire hold you where armies never could. The fields have gone quiet tonight, and for once in history, you do not have to be brave. Good night, humans.